Hi everyone, today we'll learn how to connect UI component with backend on dPlat. So first of all, we'll be taking three type of most commonly used UI components, which is input, text and button component, and we'll be going to integrate them with the backend components like smart contracts, JS objects and plugins. So let's take input component first and we'll search it and we'll use it, and then we'll take text component and a button component. So let's try to understand the UI components first. So as you can see, every UI component have a name. So if I hover over a component, the name of the component is text1, and we can edit the name from here, and let's name it text instead of text1, and this input component as input. So now the name is updated, and we'll name this button component as button. So as you can see that whichever UI component we click on, we can see we can assign it some properties and we can style it. So we can also access the values of these components within another component. Suppose I type the text as the value of this input component. So the name of this component is input. So I'll type it input.text. So whatever I type on this input component, I can access it on this text component here. So suppose I type hello world here, as you can see that it applies on the input component here. So similarly, we can use these UI components in our backend components like smart contract, JavaScript objects and plugin. So let's start with our plugin component. So we'll go to plugins, we'll do add plugin, and we'll choose a plugin from here, which is today we'll be using REST API. So I choose this REST API. I can rename it. So suppose I name it API, and so we'll be using a test URL for testing our API component, so which is hopscotch.io, and we'll be passing it a post request and this body parameters. So suppose I pass in a value and I need the value for this value input here. So where I'll be taking that value from? So suppose, as we know that we already had three components in our UI, so I'll be taking that input from this input component. So how can I access that in our plugin? So when we go back to plugin, so we'll open two curly braces here and the name of our component, which was input, and we'll do input dot text. So whatever input there will be, it will apply here. So let's go back, and the third component we can see here is a button component. So a button component can execute an input component, can help us to take some input from user, and a text component can help us to show the return values from whichever functions we execute. So for executing our API plugin, what we do that we have on click property on our button component. So we click it here and we choose execute a query. So this is a plugin query, and we see that our API plugin is getting displayed here. So we choose API. So now we have our text component here. So on our text component, what we can do is we can show whatever our API is going to return. So suppose I write in API.data. So whatever that API will return, it will be displayed here. So suppose I click on submit, that API call got fired, and we can see that the content of the API, what got returned from API, is being displayed here, and we can verify it from here also. So suppose I pass in some random text here instead of, so I pass in hello and I execute this API. So that value is being displayed here, as you can see. So this is how we integrate our UI component with our plugins. And now we are going to see how we are going to connect our UI components with smart contracts. So suppose I go to smart contracts, I choose a contract, and here we can see we have a simple hello world contract here. I select it and I choose a new method. I can also rename this smart contract name here from here, and suppose I choose new method here, and now I can name my function here. So I'm going to be using, so there are two type of functions here, store and retrieve. So I'm going to choose store method from here. So I choose store. So as you can see now that the store method takes an input. So, and I want to take this input from that input component, input UI component. So what I do, I open two curly braces. I know that the name of that component is input. So I can see that it is already recommending the input.text value from our input component. So I click it. As you can see now, whatever value will be assigned to that input component, it will get displayed here. And the next part is whatever gets returned from our function, we can display it here. So the name of our smart contract function is store. So what we can do is store.data. So whatever value we get from that function, it can be displayed here. And on the button component, we can choose what we want to do on click of this button. So we see that we have this option here, execute a smart contract function, and we are getting our function here. So this is how we can integrate our UI component with smart contracts. And the last we have is JS objects. So let's see how we can integrate our UI component with JS objects. So when I click JS objects, I see an option of add JS object here. I click it and I can name it JS object, and I see that it's a JavaScript object, and we can assign the variables here, and we can assign functions also. So suppose I assign I create a hello world function here which just returns hello world, right? So what we do is we go back to our UI, and on click of that button, so first of all on text component we can assign it whatever is getting returned from this JS object function. So JS object dot, we can see that we have this hello world dot data here. So I click it, so whatever that function will return will be displayed here. And on click of a button, what I can do is execute that function. So we go to execute a JS function, execute a JS object, and within that JS object we have hello world function that we created. So what I will do is I click on submit, and whatever that function returned is getting displayed here. So that's how we can integrate our UI components with all three types of backend components, which are smart contract, JavaScript objects, and plugins. Thank you.